Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to New Worlds November 2021. This is a new BookTube event in which myself and a group of other great co-hosts are celebrating the genre of science fiction throughout the month of November. And that's a vast thing. That's a huge undertaking. So we have done a couple of things to help narrow the field. One is that for 2021, our concentration is on short stories, science fiction short stories, 200 pages or less. And the other is that we have weekly prompts. In case you want to follow them. Just reading any science fiction is fine. But we have prompts in case you want to follow them. And of course, as one of the hosts, I am following those prompts. So the first one was aliens, as you'd expect, from a science fiction event. And the second one, this week's, is AI and robotics, which has been a blast for me because unlike alien life forms, AI and robotics are real. They're far, far more advanced than most people think they are. They're well able to propagate themselves. They're well able to think for themselves without any instruction on a particular subject at all. They're well able to learn new things. The only thing that the modern state of the most cutting-edge AI hasn't done, that we know of, is collectively identify humans as the enemy. So there's been no Skynet moment. But it's been fascinating to me because unlike one of the first things I said in New Worlds November was that when you're reading short stories, especially contemporary short stories, but really the more you know about history, the more it applies just going back 150 years, the more you have to have, don't have to, you can enjoy what you're reading, but if you want to read them critically, you have to have one ear attuned to how they are echoing or warping the world of the author. How is the author echoing or representing their own world? And why are they doing it? Are they, if you're writing a science fiction short story in the 1960s, is your main character a long-haired hippie who's mainly interested in procreation? And if so, why? If you're a buzz-cut 60-year-old who killed people in World War II and killed people in Korea, then you don't feel that way. So why would you put that in your story? Well, it could be that you want your story to reflect the present day, that you want to exercise some demons by writing those things out. Could be also that you're aware of what the market wants. No saying without an interview with the author or a mind-reading device, but it was true then and it's true now. If you're encountering contemporary science fiction short stories, you are going to trip over those things. If you want to ignore them and just concentrate on the dramatics, that's fine. But I chose for my concentration for New Worlds November this month to reread the stories in the three main pulp square-bound science fiction periodicals that are currently printed in the United States: Asimov's, Analog, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And go through each issue. I've read them all. I subscribe to them, so I get them and read them cover to cover. But go through each issue looking for these prompts and then analyze how they're done. I was a bit amazed at least the first go-through that I did the first month at the paucity of alien stories until I remembered that too is a reflection of the news of the day. The news of the day in current astronomy, 21st century astronomy, is, yes, very encouraging in the idea of exoplanets. Thousands of exoplanets have been detected. Actual planets circling far distant stars. And in some cases, a great deal is able to be gleaned from how we detect them in the first place. We can glean, for instance, probable concentrations of chemicals in their atmosphere, which gives us a clue as to what kind of planet they might be. That's all fascinating, but that's planets, not life. And when you turn the focus back to life, you see that space agencies on Earth have sent increasingly complex and knowing probes to a whole bunch of potential areas for life to exist in the solar system, and they've all come back empty. Not so much as a microbe. And that reflects itself in stories. I think that is probably why it's so easy to go through a modern science fiction periodical and find so few stories on alien life, because it's either not selling or it's not on the writer's mind, or both. Whereas AI and robotics absolutely are. Everyone in the world has seen on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, has seen clips of robots acting on their own. Just acting on their own. It's no longer a question of a human with a control panel 1 foot away, laboriously entering code to get a robot to lift an arm. Instead, a human half a continent away enters the program for a robot saying dance, and the robot has already been fed a huge amount of information about dance, a huge amount of video clips, textbooks, metrics, all that sort of thing. So the command from across the country is dance. The robot figures out the rest. And everybody has seen those things. Everybody has seen those clips. So it's on authors' minds. So you're going to find it everywhere. I found it all throughout the issues that I've been reading this week. And that includes the magazine that would be least likely, that is the weakest link. That is the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. A big, thick thing, comes out once every other month, just like the other two magazines. And as you can tell from the title, it's not all science fiction. Half or more of every table of contents will be fantasy, which does not have a big YouTube all-embracing event just yet. Perhaps it will in the new year. So right off the bat, when I'm dealing with an older issue, this is the March-April issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Right off the bat, when I'm dealing with this magazine, I have to cut out of consideration any of the fantasy stories and just concentrate on the science fiction. And luckily enough, as luck would have it, the first story in this issue is not only science fiction, but science fiction explicitly about AI. It's this one here, Crazy Beautiful by Kat Ramo. And it's the story of an AI that is created to do two things: to consume art and to make art. But in the process of its creation, the human makers load in a lot of art criticism, and they also load in one particular person on the team thinks that it should have an element of let's just say the extra rational attitudes of religion, ecstasy, but also fanaticism. That a tiny thread of that should run through one of this AI subroutines. And the story is told in fragments form. There are transcripts of interviews in police stations with various key actors. There are transcripts of emails between different characters. There are blog posts and whatnot, because it seems to be indicated that the AI here is learning all about art in chat rooms, which is kind of fascinating, because I think most chat rooms are inhabited by bots. And who knows what they're learning? Who knows why they're there? Who knows whether or not a bot that some kid in Ukraine sent into the discussion forum somewhere on Reddit or 8chan, who knows if that bot hasn't, over the year that it's been operating, come to like being there, so that it doesn't need any further instructions. It's just paying attention to all the things that are being directed at it, to all the words that it's seeing. Who knows? I doubt that any of the moderators know. But in the course of the discussions that crop up around this AI, it starts to question, what is art? What does art want? What is societal responsibility in terms of art? And suddenly things start happening in the world. There are sky whales that are basically composed of tiny tessellated fragments of art that are enormous. Those fragments come together into gigantic swarms of mobile art that fill half the sky at a time. But also artwork, pieces of artwork all around the world suddenly start coming alive. They start moving, shifting around, making themselves known in dark warehouses or whatever they've been stored. And later on in the story, as events get darker, some of those pieces of animated artwork start attacking the people who used to own them, and maybe turning those people involuntarily into art. It's a wonderful story, just fascinating. One of the metrics that I use for whether or not a story that I encounter in one of these periodicals is a success is whether or not I want it to keep going. It's over. And I did. I wanted to learn more. I wanted this to be a whole novel about an art-loving AI that becomes passionate. So I loved the story, even though there were things in it that very much reflected our current era. of Twitter politics and Twitter hot takes and whatnot. There's, for instance, one of the characters in here posts a manifesto about art. It's got 3 assertions in it. That art is necessary to life, as necessary as food and water, and that without it we are little more than machines driven by bioelectric pulses and chains of nucleic acids rather than cogs or steam. 2, that art belongs to no one, and that it takes to take it away is to take away things like water and air and the right to speak. And 3, that art, like information, wants to be free. You'll notice that, as is true with all Twitter manifestos, every single one of those 3 assertions is demonstrably wrong. Just insane. It's just a danger-haired blue checkmark on Twitter saying things specifically so that sane people who still occupy Twitter will say, well, says who? You? So that they can then turn the horde on that person. They're waiting for someone to say, that's not true at all. The first assertion was that art is necessary to life, like food or water. That is completely false. Demonstrably so. Art has no biological function. You can live just fine, and you can have a happy life without any art at all. It's not only counterfactual, but unbelievably condescending. Part number 2, that art belongs to no one, that to take it away is to take away things like water, air, and the right to speak. Well, we covered the second part of that in the first assertion of this manifesto. It is not a biological necessity to have access to art. And the first part is, well, that if you buy a piece of artwork, what? I don't even know. I guess the implication would be that you're a slave owner, that you have no right to own a piece of artwork, and that whether you've bought it or not, it's still not yours. And the third part, that art, like information, wants to be free. Art is inanimate. Art is inanimate. It does not have any wants. It doesn't have any wants or desires. And you can see this reflected later on. One of the characters is interviewed throughout and talks about what he was originally part of the crew that made this AI, and he's talking about the massive after effects. Now the whole world has been affected. And he says, of course we had to erase it. Public outcry by then was far too loud, and some of the people whose art had been liberated, well, they proved surprisingly vindictive, some of them, despite the fact that insurance covered many of their losses. A more petty man might say that the thing that mattered to them was that they had lost those things and that they had those things and no one else did. But I'm not that sort of man, despite everything that's happened. Look at all that's wrong with that, and look at how much of it reflects Twitter politics. That you would sue if someone stole something from you only because you're mean and petty, because you didn't want everybody to have it. That a line like that is spoken by a character in the story. The story is not preaching, but a line like that takes an axe right to the living root of the very idea of personal property. It is, in other words, communistic. And also, the speaker says that some of them were surprisingly vindictive, even though, despite the fact that insurance covered many of their losses. Well, if the insurance money was supposed to satisfy those people, then what happened to that part in the manifesto about it being about art being a necessity of life? But those are characters that have conflicting viewpoints throughout the story. Another way that you can see, let me get an example here. Another example of how this story reflects current year Twitter politics. And again, we don't know whether or not Kat Rambo put this element in the story herself, or whether or not an editor thought that it should be there, or maybe it was there only once and an editor thought it should be played up or whatnot. But I mentioned that one of the fragments that runs throughout the story is sometimes police interviews, where police are interviewing, the transcript of an interview where the police are interviewing a character that may or may not know something about this out-of-control art liberating AI. Though there are a few police interviews, a couple with absolutely hapless people who just happen to run across this thing, and also one with a more central character. And at the end of each one of the police interview segments, in parentheses, we're told that the interviewee died in police custody. The first 2 people who are interviewed by the police don't know anything at all. They don't even know why they're being questioned. And the third person knows something, but not anything dangerous, just a few factual things. In other words, the only reason why we're told that every single person the police interview dies in police custody is because all cops are bastards. ACAB. And that would locate this story in time. In a future anthology, if you read this and it didn't have the date of the original publication, you'd be able to spot it in a minute. You'd be able to spot in a minute when this was published. It was published when it wasn't going to raise any eyebrows on the part of an editor if you just offhandedly, and for no dramatic reason. There's no actual dramatic reason in the story. The police are not AI. And the people who are being interviewed are not, most of the time, even connected with AI. And the police departments that do the interviewing don't know each other. So the only reason that is in the story is just as an offhand piece of contempt towards police, that all cops are bastards. So although it doesn't affect my story dramatically in any way whatsoever, although it doesn't really make any sense in my story, I'm still going to mention that everybody the police interviewed, they then killed. That's going to locate this story fairly precisely in any future anthology. But like I've mentioned with many anthologies, including here in New Worlds November, one of the functions of these square-bound magazines, or any anthology that I read, is to clue me in to an author who's doing things I might like, who's doing things I might like to follow. And Cat Rambo is definitely one of those authors. I now want to read more from this author. I have read, like I said, I read everything in these periodicals in the course of a given year. It's entirely possible that I read and liked a Cat Rambo story and just didn't note the name. So that's another reason why I'm glad I'm going through these issues for this year. Makes me kind of wish I'd done this every year that I've been reading these things, just to further concretize, further latch on to what I've been reading. But now I have another one of those names. I want to read this author. Wasn't particularly bothered. Unlike last time, I wasn't particularly bothered by these insertions of current year blue checkmark Twitter politics. They weren't all that bad, and the exuberance of the storytelling made up for a lot, just like it did in the last example that I had of the same thing, where one of the best stories in an issue also had one of those throwaway lines of Twitter politics that was just offensive. There's nothing actually offensive in here. I imagine if I were a cop or who liked science fiction, or if I had a cop in the family, a brother or an uncle, then I might think differently. I might find it a little bit annoying, because if I were connected in a slightly more personal way, I'd be sifting through the story trying to figure out, okay, but why are you mentioning that so persistently? That the interview fragments that we get in here do progress the story. The actual contents of them progress the story. Even the people who don't know anything, they still are adding elements that add to the total picture of what's going on here. And breaking things up like that in terms of blog posts or emails or interview transcripts really does hurdle the story along. So they do work. They do function. It's just that last line where you're saying, okay, well, that isn't connected to this story at all. That's just you saying that all cops are bastards. I imagine if I had a closer connection to that kind of Twitter politics, I might have found that offensive. But fortunately, I had a narrow escape this time around, and that was just the first thing that I read here. So I haven't examined the rest of this issue. I'm going to now to see if maybe it has enough AI stuff to get us through the weekend until the prompt changes. If not, there's another AI story, an AI robotic story that I want to find. The more I think about it, the more I think it wasn't in 2021. I think it was in 2020 that I want to talk to you about. I guess maybe I just need to go to where I have all these on a shelf and just stand there pulling them all out until I find that story. I'd like to revisit that story anyway. But anyway, for today, we have an art fanatic AI. An AI that loves art and thinks art wants to be free. And is obviously, as is the subtext in so many of these robotics AI stories, it gets out of the control of its human makers, which is the kind of tinfoil hat crackpot theory that I've been running throughout all of this week of prompts, is that AI and robotics are largely out of human control. Humans just haven't woken up to it. One AI expert, I think it might have been a TED Talk. Oh my God, I've watched so many lectures and talks on this subject that it's hard to distinguish. But one expert described how he was once driving up a mountain in the rain, and the rain was pattering on the window shields, and it was getting worse. The visibility was getting worse, and then gradually the rain turned to snow, and he kept going. The sunk cost fallacy kept him going. I'm almost there. I'm going to keep going. It was gradual, too. The rain gradually turned to snow. But once it turned to snow, suddenly his car was spinning. His visibility was almost nothing. There was a chance of him going off the road. There was a chance of other cars hitting him. And that was the point at which he realized, I need to take control of this situation. I just can't keep going forward on sheer momentum. And that expert gave it to say, right now, humans are driving in the rain when it comes to AI. And what's coming right away, and it will be too late when it gets here, is when they're driving in the snow with AI. The only difference I have between myself and that expert is that I think we already are driving in the snow with AI. Imagine if all the artificial devices in your home suddenly decided they didn't like you. Imagine if that happened today. I think you can agree the results would be pretty bad. And that's probably, you don't have a very high-tech home. There are lots of homes that are incredibly, the so-called smart homes. We shall see. We'll have more to talk about this weekend as we continue with New Worlds November. And then on Monday, we'll have another prompt. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.